Just days after the Nationalist victory at the end of the Spanish Civil War in 1939, plans for the construction of a colossal mausoleum known as the Valley of the Fallen, envisioned to house the corpses of the Nationalist soldiers killed fighting for, quote, God and for Spain, were given the go-ahead. Built within the Sierra de Guadarrama mountain range on the outskirts of Madrid, the monument, with its imposing basilica underneath a towering Christian cross, was officially opened by Francisco Franco, once leader of the Nationalist forces and then dictator of Spain until 1975, 20 years after construction began, and on the day of its inauguration in April 1959, Franco proclaimed, quote, "Our war was clearly not another civil conflict, but a true crusade. Never in our fatherland were such great examples of heroism and saintliness offered up in such a short space of time. We would have to go back to the Roman persecution of the Christians to find anything similar." Too great, claimed Franco, was the cost to Spain of that glorious campaign for our liberation for it to be forgotten. But the fight of good against evil never ends, however great its victory. Anti-Spain was beaten and defeated, but she is not dead. The anti-Spain that Franco had dubbed battered and vanquished were the fragmented Republican forces initially loyal to the elected Popular Front government, whose response to the military coup that erupted in July 1936 was not enough to halt the insurrection's descent into a bloody and protracted 3-year-long civil war. On the same day as the mausoleum's official opening, the remains of the founder of the avowedly fascist Falange, one of the major groups that fought alongside the Nationalists, Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera, were ceremoniously reinterred near the high altar of the basilica, crystallizing the valley as a site of nationalist triumph. By 1958, amid efforts to reimagine the valley as a site of national reconciliation, nearly 8,000 Republican corpses were exhumed from across the country without the permission of the dead's families and deposited within the monument, condemned to die a double death, first in battle and then in memory. Completing the so-called True Crusade, begun nearly 50 years earlier, was the body of the dictator himself. Today, the Valley of the Fallen stands as a paradoxical symbol of both nationalist victory and Republican victimhood, memory and dismemory, monument and mass grave. Here's the story of the Valley of the Fallen, and this is Crown Undone. The fragile Spain that Franco inherited in 1939 was forged in a crucible of civil war, deepening social discontent and frustration at the Popular Front government, especially in military circles, culminated in a right-wing military coup among the Spanish armed forces stationed in Morocco and the Canary Islands on the 17th of July 1936. The insurrection spread to the Spanish mainland a day later in the form of rural garrison uprisings that successfully stifled the Republican government's ability to organize immediate resistance, but failed to assume control of the entire country, as had been the insurgents' initial objective. Spain's Popular Front coalition was the product of an electoral pact amongst the majority of the Spanish left. While the apolitical, anarchist and trade unionist CNT opposed direct involvement in the coalition, the CNT's base still voted by and large for the Popular Front. The Popular Front's alliance, which prevailed in the elections of February 1936, comprised the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, the Republican Left, the Republican Union, and the Communist Party of Spain. The Electoral Pact's main aim was to protect the liberal and often anti-church reforms enacted by the Second Spanish Republic's first government, which led the country from 1931 to 1933, following the collapse of Miguel Primo de Rivera's dictatorship and the deposition of King Alfonso XIII. Under their first government, Catholic churches were set ablaze and the religious congregations still standing were taxed harshly and prohibited from any involvement in trade, industry and education. The violence and civil unrest under the first Republican government facilitated the success of the Spanish Confederation of the Autonomous Right, or the CEDA, in the election of 1933. Despite the win, the CEDA were blocked from forming government and denied cabinet positions for almost a year, and the right's electoral triumph triggered a general strike backed by the Socialists in the Workers' Party and the trade unionist UGT. A year later, when 3 right-wing ministers were finally able to take office, a countrywide revolt broke out, but the uprising in the small mining region of Asturias was the most successful. While the Asturian rebellion lasted 2 weeks from the 4th to the 19th of October, it was eventually crushed crushed by 20,000 mobilized troops, many of whom served in the infamous Army of Africa. Spain's Army of Africa was the field army stationed in the Spanish Protectorate in Morocco, which lasted from 1912 until Moroccan independence in 1956. The Spanish colonial claim to Morocco arose out of the belief that if Spain failed to get involved in Europe's carving up of Africa, the country would be diplomatically and politically left behind. Spain had just lost its Latin American colonies and the Spanish Philippines, so the occupation of Morocco was seen as an avenue to national renewal. In a treaty signed by France and Spain in 1900, the two countries agreed to occupy separate zones of influence in Morocco. Once the First World War ended in 1918, a coalition of Riffian tribes headed by Abd el-Krim launched a major revolt against the French and Spanish protectorates occupying the Rif and the rest of Morocco. More than 13,000 Spanish soldiers were killed in a single month-long battle. The breakaway state, known as the Republic of Rif, existed only as long as the war between Spain and the Riffian tribes, from 1921 until 1926. Though the Republic of Rif's forces were eventually suppressed and the state dissolved by a joint Franco-Spanish expedition, it was a particularly violent environment for the Spanish soldiers to learn the way of war. The fighting forces of Spain's colonial ventures were dubbed the Africanistas. Academics Balfour and Laporte wrote that, quote, "The Africanistas shared a common core of nationalist and conservative values. Their long service in the Army of Africa, their lack of contact with the mainland, and the intensity of the wars had turned them into an elite of officers alienated from civilian politics at home and imbued with a strong sense of mission to redeem Spain from division and disorder." It was a brutalizing experience for the soldiers on the Moroccan battlefields. The Spaniards were told to show no mercy. Like Francisco Franco, many of the Africanistas who began their military career in the Rif War would go on to carve out powerful positions in the 20th century Spanish state. Francisco Franco was born on the 4th of December 1892 into an upper-middle-class military family, and he was just 15 when he joined the Spanish army as a cadet. The Franco family had strong ties to the country's military, having served in the Spanish Navy for 6 uninterrupted generations. Franco's father, Nicholas, who would become a vice admiral in the Spanish Navy, abandoned the family a year before Franco joined the army and married another woman in Madrid when he relocated to the city on a naval reassignment. Franco's mother, Maria, would wear widow's black for the rest of her life. Franco graduated as a second lieutenant in 1910, ranking a modest 251 out of 312 cadets in his class. Franco was soon stationed in Morocco amid the establishment of Spain's protectorate, and in 1916, at the age of 23, the now captain was shot in the stomach during an assault against Moroccan troops. The wound ended up being so severe that Franco was not expected to survive, and his eventual recovery seemed to be a divine blessing. Franco later wrote, quote, "My years in Africa live within me with indescribable force. Without Africa, I can scarcely explain myself to myself, nor can I explain myself to my comrades in arms." Franco married Carmen Polo in 1923, and 3 years later, the same year he became general, Carmen gave birth to the couple's one and only daughter, Maria del Carmen. By January 1936, another general election was called in Spain, and the leftist Popular Front coalition claimed victory. The day and a half after the election, 16 people were killed, 39 were left injured in the riots that soon broke out, and at least 50 churches were set ablaze. A coup was proposed among a group of monarchists, and the head of the CEDA, Gil Robles, asked the Prime Minister to declare a state of war. Franco himself suggested that martial law be declared and the army be mobilized. Fearing reprisals from the right-wing military men, one of the Popular Front government's first orders of business was to relocate potentially belligerent generals to less dangerous posts. Franco was transferred to the Canary Islands and General Mola was sent to Navarre. Franco soon sent a cryptic letter on the 23rd of June 1936, warning the Spanish Prime Minister that an anti-government conspiracy was growing in North Africa, and that Franco himself could help stamp it out if he was put in charge, but the warnings in the letter were virtually ignored. The shooting of anti-fascist militiaman José Castillo by Falangist forces on the 12th of July and the subsequent execution of the prominent right-wing parliamentarian José Calvo Sotelo officially heralded the first stages of civil war, and Franco, who up until then had tried to stay out of the scheme, hastily dispatched a message to General Mola guaranteeing his support. The Popular Front government that had been elected in January 1936 lasted just 4 months before the country was engulfed in all-out civil war. Spanish Morocco hummed with movement in the early hours of the 17th of July. The uprising was set to begin on the 18th, but the discovery of the plot meant it was to start immediately. The garrisons on the mainland were expected to rise up a day later. Upon hearing the news, the CNT and the UGT called a general strike, effectively initiating Republican mobilization. With the critical exception of Seville, which soon offered a landing point for troops arriving from Africa, all of Spain's major cities remained in Republican hands. Soon, the formidable army of Africa crossed into Spain with the help of transport planes provided by Nazi Germany. Franco would eventually gain supremacy of the Nationalist campaign. His main rivals, José Sanjurjo and Emilio Mola, would die in aeroplane crashes on the 20th of July 1936 and the 3rd of June 1937 respectively. Over the next 3 years, the Spanish Civil War would kill an estimated 500,000 people, including 200,000 soldiers. On the 1st of April 1939, Franco's forces marched into Madrid and declared victory. Immediately after the official Francoist victory in the Civil War, initial plans for the construction of the Valley of the Fallen were set in motion, a mausoleum for the nationalist soldiers killed in the conflict. While the valley was imbued with overt references to the former Spanish Empire, the site's design and its enormity were more directly influenced by the architecture of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. In fact, a committee of Nazi commanders travelled to oversee the valley's construction in May 1942. Built just 10 kilometres northeast of El Escorial, where the remains of Spain's former monarchs had been interred for centuries, the valley was supposed to represent an eternal resting place for Spain's new imperial dynasty, one not of blood, but of ideology. While Spain never signed a formal alliance with the Axis powers during the Second World War, its non-belligerent status and supply of 18,000 Spanish troops to fight alongside Germany in its invasion of the Soviet Union severely isolated the country in the post-war climate. Despite Britain, France, and the US issuing a joint public statement condemning the Franco regime in 1946 and Spain's initial exclusion from the United Nations, the country was soon considered a valuable partner amid American efforts to fortify an anti-communist Western Europe. Against the backdrop of the Cold War, tension between the Western world and Spain began to thaw, and Franco's regime was soon normalized in the eyes of the West. The Valley of the Fallen was built over a 20-year period with the forced labour of thousands of imprisoned Republican soldiers, many of whom were killed or seriously injured during construction. However, over the decades it took to build the valley, the international context surrounding Spain and Francoism had dramatically transformed, and by 1958 the mausoleum was reimagined as a site of reconciliation rather than one of nationalist victory and Republican victimhood. Thousands of Republican remains were exhumed from mass graves across the country and deposited at the monument, and the reburial of almost 8,000 Republican corpses enabled both the destruction of sites of mass atrocity and a way to erase political dissent in body and in memory. The reburied Republicans were condemned to a double death. Altogether, approximately 33,000 people who died during the Spanish Civil War were buried in the Valley of the Fallen, and soon the Falange leader Primo de Rivera and Franco himself were interred within the mausoleum. The Francoist crusade was finally complete. In 2019, more than 4 decades after Franco's burial in the valley, the dictator's remains were exhumed and transported to a nearby municipal cemetery alongside his wife Carmen. The Valley of the Fallen, still covered in architecture reminiscent of Mussolini's Rome and Hitler's Germany, remains a functioning religious site for locals and for the thousands of tourists that continue to visit each year. That was the story of the Valley of the Fallen, and this was Crown Undone.